The highway stretched endlessly, a dark ribbon slicing through the barren plains. Paul drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, the rhythmic thud of his tires against the pavement, the only sound accompanying the radio's low static. It was late, well past midnight. He had been driving for hours, the flickering gas station signs and the occasional lone diner the only evidence of civilization. He yawned, rubbing his eyes. Maybe he should pull over soon. But the next town wasn't for another 50 miles, and the thought of stopping on the side of the road unsettled him. Then he saw her. A figure standing by the shoulder, barely illuminated by the headlights. A woman, young, with long black hair hanging over her face. She wore a pale blue dress that fluttered in the breeze, her bare feet planted firmly on the cold pavement. She didn't hold out her thumb, didn't move. Just stood there, her head slightly tilted, watching as his truck approached. Paul's hands clenched the wheel. Something about her made his skin crawl. Hitchhikers weren't uncommon on lonely roads like this, but she seemed wrong. Still, he was exhausted, and the thought of leaving a stranded woman alone in the dead of night didn't sit right with him. Against his better judgment, he pulled over. The passenger door creaked as he leaned over. "You need a ride?" he asked. The woman nodded once. She moved in an eerie, smooth motion, slipping into the truck without a word. Paul glanced at her as she settled into the seat. Her hair still obscured most of her face, but her skin was unnaturally pale, her hands folded delicately in her lap. He swallowed. "Where you headed?" Silence. Paul forced a chuckle. "Not much of a talker, huh?" Still, nothing. The woman simply turned her head slightly toward the windshield as if signaling him to drive. A chill crept up his spine, but he shook it off and pressed his foot on the gas. The truck rumbled forward, the road stretching into the abyss once more. Minutes passed in silence, thick and suffocating. The longer Paul drove, the more uneasy he felt. He stole quick glances at his passenger, but she barely moved, her hands never shifting, her posture unnaturally rigid. Then she spoke. "Slow down." Her voice was barely above a whisper, yet it cut through the truck's interior like a blade. Paul's foot hovered over the brake. "Why? Something wrong?" "Slow down," she repeated. The hairs on his arms rose. He did as she asked, easing the truck to a slower speed. The moment he did, a deer burst from the trees, leaping across the road. Paul cursed, jerking the wheel just in time to avoid hitting it. His heart pounded. If he had been going any faster... He turned to the woman. "Hey, thanks." But she was gone. The seat beside him was empty. Paul's breath hitched. He nearly veered off the road, his hands shaking as he gripped the wheel. His mind raced. Had she jumped out? Impossible. He hadn't heard the door open. The air inside the truck felt ice cold. Paul scanned the road through the rearview mirror, expecting to see her standing there, watching. Nothing. Shaking, he pressed down on the accelerator, eager to put distance between himself and whatever had just happened. But the dread sat heavy in his chest. Had he imagined her? Was he so exhausted that he had hallucinated the whole thing? His knuckles whitened as he gripped the wheel. No, she had been real. He had felt the shift in weight when she got in, had heard her voice, had seen her. A whisper brushed against his ear. "You didn't thank me." Paul's stomach dropped. The voice was inside the truck. Slowly, trembling, he turned his head. She was sitting in the back seat. Her hair was still draped over her face, but he could see her lips curled into a pale, unnatural smile. His breath hitched. He slammed his foot on the brake. The truck screeched to a halt, tires skidding against the asphalt. Paul scrambled for the door handle, desperate to escape. Then he heard it. Laughter. Low, hollow, and echoing, surrounding him from all sides. He turned back. She was gone again. The truck's engine hummed softly, the night air still and suffocating. Paul's chest heaved. He didn't care if he was in the middle of nowhere. He had to get out. He threw the door open and stumbled onto the pavement, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked around, but there was nothing, just endless darkness stretching in all directions. He wasn't alone. Somewhere, just beyond the reach of his headlights, he felt it. Felt her. Watching. Waiting. Then, in the quiet, her voice drifted to him, carried on the wind. Drive safe. Paul didn't need to be told twice. He dove back into the truck, slammed the door shut, and floored the gas pedal, tires screeching as he sped away from the stretch of road that would forever haunt his nightmares. He never picked up another hitchhiker again.
Story number 2.
The gas station at the edge of town was the last stop before the long, empty stretch of highway that cut through the dense pine forest. The neon sign flickered, buzzing like an angry insect in the quiet night. Ben pulled his truck into the lot, stretching his arms with a sigh. Last stop for 100 miles, the attendant said as Ben filled up. The guy was old, with a thin face and sunken eyes, watching him with an unsettling intensity. You heading through Pine Hollow? Ben nodded. Yeah, figured I'd drive straight through. Gotta make good time. The old man wiped his hands on a rag. Keep your doors locked, he muttered. Ben frowned. That's supposed to mean something? The man hesitated, then shook his head. Just don't stop for anyone. Not out there. Ben chuckled, brushing off the warning as local superstition. I'll keep that in mind. He paid, grabbed a coffee, and pulled back onto the road, the headlights cutting through the inky blackness. The highway was desolate, stretching endlessly ahead of him. Towering trees loomed on either side, their skeletal branches swaying in the wind. He turned up the radio, trying to drown out the eerie quiet. The first time he saw her, he thought he was imagining things. A woman, standing on the shoulder of the road, illuminated for a split second by his high beams. She was barefoot, wearing a tattered white dress, her long dark hair falling over her face. Ben's grip tightened on the wheel. By the time he registered what he'd seen, he had already passed her. His stomach knotted. Maybe she was in trouble? He slowed slightly, glancing in the rearview mirror. She was gone. She's gone. He shook his head. Get a grip, man, he muttered, forcing his foot back onto the gas. Maybe it was a trick of the light. Maybe. A cold whisper brushed his ear. Why didn't you stop? Ben's body went rigid. The voice had come from inside the truck. His hands clenched the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He dared to glance at the rearview mirror. She was sitting in the back seat. His heart seized. The woman, the same one from the roadside, was behind him. Her head tilted at an unnatural angle, her hair slipping away from her face, revealing hollow black eyes and a twisted smile. Ben swerved violently, the truck fishtailing before he corrected it. What the hell? He gasped. The woman didn't move, didn't blink. Her voice was barely above a whisper. I needed a ride. His breath came in ragged gasps. His mind screamed at him to pull over, to jump out, to run, but the terror rooted him to his seat. Then, as suddenly as she had appeared, she was gone. The back seat was empty. Ben's pulse hammered in his ears. He blinked rapidly, glancing over his shoulder. Nothing. Just the dark expanse of the road behind him. He took a shaky breath. I'm losing it, he whispered. He drove faster. The highway stretched on endlessly, the trees pressing in closer. The darkness felt heavier now, the night air thick with something unseen. Then, movement. Ben barely had time to react. The woman was in the middle of the road. His headlights caught her as she lunged forward, her face twisted in a silent scream. Ben jerked the wheel hard, his tires screeching as he veered off the road. The truck skidded onto the shoulder, sliding to a stop just inches from the trees. His chest heaved, his hands trembled. She was gone. Shaking, he reached for his phone. No signal. Of course, a slow, suffocating silence settled over the forest. He exhaled shakily, gripping the wheel. Screw this, he muttered, shifting the truck into drive. A hand slammed against his window. Ben screamed. The woman's face was pressed against the glass, her black eyes staring into his. Her lips parted, her breath fogging the window as she whispered, Let me in. Ben floored the gas. The truck lurched forward, nearly throwing him against the seatbelt. The trees blurred past, the road winding in an endless, twisting nightmare. He didn't stop, didn't look back. The highway eventually opened up, the forest thinning. The first traces of dawn painted the sky a sickly shade of gray. Ben didn't breathe until he saw the next gas station. He pulled in, shaking so badly he could barely park. The attendant, a young woman, leaned out the window. You okay? Ben swallowed hard. I saw something on the road. Her expression darkened. A woman? His stomach dropped. Yeah, the woman sighed. You're not the first. Ben's mouth went dry. She died out there, the attendant continued. Years ago, a hitchhiker. Someone picked her up, but she never made it out. Ben's head pounded. They say she still waits for someone to take her the rest of the way home. Ben didn't respond. He just got back in his truck and drove.
Story number 3.
The road stretched endlessly through the desolate countryside, flanked by darkened cornfields that swayed gently in the night breeze. Matt had been driving for hours, and exhaustion clawed at his mind. He glanced at the digital clock on his dashboard. 2:13 a.m. He still had another 100 miles to go before he reached his motel. Yawning, he rolled down the window, hoping the cold air would keep him awake. The radio crackled with static, light, and after fiddling with the dial to no avail, he sighed and turned it off. The only sound now was the steady hum of his tires against the cracked pavement. Then he saw her. A woman standing by the roadside, barely illuminated by the moonlight. She wore a long, flowing white dress, and her hair cascaded down her back in thick, tangled waves. Matt's grip tightened on the wheel. Normally, he wouldn't pick up hitchhikers, but there was something about her that unsettled him. She wasn't holding out her thumb, wasn't waving him down. She just stood there, motionless, staring as he approached. His truck roared past her, but as he glanced in the rearview mirror, she was gone. His chest tightened. Had she been real? Maybe exhaustion was messing with his mind. Shaking his head, he focused on the road ahead. But a mile later, she was there again, standing at the side of the road, identical to before. Matt's pulse hammered in his ears. He hit the gas, speeding past her. Another mile. She was there again. His breath hitched. This wasn't possible. His hands were slick on the wheel as he drove faster. Another mile. She was closer to the road now. Her head tilted slightly as if she was watching him more intently. Panic surged through Matt's veins. He pressed harder on the accelerator. The truck roared forward, his heart pounding in his throat. Another mile. She was in the middle of the road. Matt's scream tore from his throat as he yanked the wheel, swerving violently. The truck skidded, the tires screeching against the asphalt. He barely avoided the woman, veering off onto the shoulder and coming to a shuddering stop. His breath came in ragged gasps. His hands trembled as he gripped the wheel, knuckles white. The road was empty. The woman was gone. For a long moment he sat frozen, heart slamming against his ribs. Then, a soft knock on his window. His body seized. Slowly, he turned his head. She was there. Standing inches away, her face pressed against the glass. Her eyes were hollow voids. Her mouth curled into an unnatural, twisted smile. The truck's interior suddenly felt ice cold. His breath fogged in the air. He couldn't move, couldn't scream. Then, the passenger door creaked open. He hadn't unlocked it. Matt's stomach lurched. The woman slid into the seat beside him, folding her hands in her lap. The scent of damp earth and decay filled the cabin. A long silence stretched between them. Then she whispered, "Drive." Matt's body moved on instinct. He shifted the truck into gear, pressing his foot to the pedal. The tires crunched against the gravel as he pulled back onto the road. He didn't dare look at her. She sat perfectly still, her hair obscuring most of her face. But out of the corner of his eye, he could see her mouth still twisted in that awful smile. The air inside the truck grew colder. His breath came in short, shallow bursts. Where are you going?" he finally managed to ask. She didn't answer. The road stretched endlessly ahead, disappearing into the darkness. Matt's hands were shaking so badly he could barely keep control of the wheel. Then she whispered, "You've been here before." A shiver crawled down his spine. "What?" he breathed. "You always drive this road." His throat tightened. No, that wasn't true. He had never been here before. Had he? The truck's headlights flickered. The radio crackled back to life, but instead of music, it played a garbled, distorted voice. "You never learn," the voice on the radio murmured. Matt's blood ran cold. The woman in the seat beside him turned her head slightly. "You always pick me up." The road seemed to stretch infinitely, the lines on the pavement blurring together. His heart pounded as realization sank in. He had been here before. He had picked her up before, and he had never made it out. Panic surged through him. He slammed on the brakes. The truck skidded to a stop. He fumbled for the door handle, desperate to escape. But the truck was no longer running. The headlights flickered off. Darkness swallowed him. The woman leaned in, her cold breath against his ear. "See you next time." Everything went black. Matt woke with a jolt. He was sitting in his truck, parked at the roadside gas station. The sun was rising, casting long shadows across the empty lot. His hands trembled as he gripped the wheel. His head ached, his thoughts sluggish. Had it been a dream? No. It had been real. But here he was, back where he had started. A slow, sinking dread filled his chest. Then, out of the corner of his eye, a woman standing at the edge of the lot, waiting. Matt's breath caught in his throat. He knew what was coming. The cycle was starting again, and this time he might not wake up.
Story number 4.
The desert highway stretched endlessly under the moonlight, a pale ribbon of cracked asphalt cutting through the barren wasteland. The only sound was the hum of David's car engine as he sped down the empty road, his headlights barely piercing the suffocating darkness. He was exhausted. His eyelids felt heavy, and every mile blurred into the next. He had been driving for hours, and there hadn't been another car in sight for miles. A green road sign flickered past. "Next gas station, 50 miles. David groaned. His fuel gauge was dipping dangerously low. He should have stopped back at the last station, but that had been nearly an hour ago, and he'd thought he could make it. The desert night pressed against his car windows, endless and unbroken. The radio had long since fizzled into static. He reached for his water bottle, but it was empty. Then he saw her, a lone hitchhiker standing at the side of the road. David's heart stuttered. She was young, maybe mid-20s, wearing a long black hoodie with the hood pulled up over her face. She stood perfectly still, her head slightly tilted toward his car as he approached. David's fingers tightened around the steering wheel. There was no way anyone should be out here. No towns, no houses, nothing for miles. As he passed, she turned her head slightly, just enough for him to see her mouth. She was smiling, a slow, creeping grin that sent ice down his spine. He didn't stop, his foot pressed harder on the gas. The car sped past, and when he looked in the rearview mirror, she was gone. David's pulse pounded in his ears. He forced himself to breathe, gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles ached. He must be more exhausted than he thought. But then, a mile later, she was there again, standing on the shoulder the exact same way. David's hands went clammy. No, that was impossible. His car roared past her, his mind screaming that this was a trick. But as he glanced in the mirror, she was standing in the middle of the road. David's foot slammed on the brakes, the tires screeched, the car skidding to a halt. His breath came in ragged gasps as he gripped the wheel, his eyes darting to the mirror. She wasn't there. The road behind him was empty. His heart pounded. His head felt light. He was just seeing things, that was all. The exhaustion, the stress, it was messing with his mind. He took a deep breath, put the car back into drive, and pressed forward. 15 miles to the gas station. Just keep driving. The silence felt heavier now, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. Then, a soft rustling sound. From the back seat. David's body went rigid. He didn't move, didn't breathe. The rearview mirror was angled just slightly toward the back seat. He forced his eyes to look. She was sitting there. Her hood still covered her face, but he could see the grin. Too wide, too sharp. David's stomach dropped. The car swerved as he jerked the wheel in panic. He nearly lost control, barely managing to steady it. Then the whisper came. "Why didn't you stop?" David's skin crawled. His grip on the wheel tightened as his pulse hammered in his ears. She was still smiling. The car's engine groaned as he floored the gas. The road blurred beneath him, but the air in the car felt suffocating, heavy, wrong. "You should have picked me up," she whispered. Her voice was layered. Not just one voice, but many. A chorus of whispers, overlapping, surrounding him. David's throat went dry. He refused to look at her, refused to acknowledge that she was still there, sitting just inches behind him. "Let me out," she whispered. David's mind reeled. His hands were shaking, but he kept driving. "Let me out." The car suddenly jerked, as if something had grabbed the wheel. David screamed, struggling to regain control. His headlights flickered. The dashboard lights dimmed. "Let me out." The road in front of him changed. It was no longer the empty highway. It was a graveyard. Rows of headstones stretched out into the darkness, stretching forever. The sky above twisted, swirling, shifting. The air was thick with the scent of dirt and decay. David slammed on the brakes. Everything vanished. He was back on the highway. His car sat idling in the middle of the road. The desert was still. The sky was black. His breath came in ragged gasps. His hands were shaking. The back seat was empty. His phone buzzed violently in the cup holder. With trembling fingers, he picked it up. Unknown number. A text message. "Next time, stop for me." David threw the phone onto the passenger seat, his body cold with sweat. His headlights caught something ahead, a gas station. The neon lights flickered, the dull hum breaking the suffocating silence. David pulled in, barely managing to park before he stumbled out of the car. His legs felt weak, his body shaking violently. An old man sat behind the counter inside. He looked up as David entered, his eyes knowing. "She got in, didn't she?" the man asked. David's stomach lurched. "You?" His voice cracked. "You know about her?" The old man sighed. "Son, we all know about her." David swallowed hard. His reflection in the window was pale, his eyes hollow. "What does she want?" The old man's expression darkened. "She's looking for a ride home." David's pulse pounded. The man leaned forward. "And if you ever see her again, don't stop. Don't look. Don't let her in." David nodded slowly, his body still trembling. He turned back toward his car, hesitating. And then his breath hitched. His driver's side door was slightly open. Inside, on the passenger seat, his phone buzzed again. One new message. With dread pooling his stomach, he slowly picked it up. "See you soon." David's breath caught, and in the window's reflection, she was sitting in the back seat. smiling.
Story number 5.
The road stretched out before Jake, an endless ribbon of blacktop cutting through the vast, empty plains. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white as the silence pressed in. It was nearly midnight, and he had been driving for hours. The GPS had taken him off the main highway, rerouting him through a back road to avoid a construction detour. It was supposed to save him time, but now he wasn't so sure. The further he drove, the more isolated the road became. No streetlights, no houses, just miles of empty fields stretching into the darkness. His gas gauge hovered near empty, and there hadn't been a gas station for miles. Then, in the distance, something appeared in his headlights. A figure. Jake's stomach tightened. It was a woman, standing by the side of the road. She wore a long, dark dress, and her hair hung over her face. She stood perfectly still, as if waiting. Jake's first instinct was to keep driving. But as he passed her, something compelled him to look in the rearview mirror. She was gone. She was gone. His chest tightened. He shook his head, trying to brush off the eerie feeling creeping up his spine. Just his imagination. Then, a few miles down the road, she was there again, standing at the side of the road, identical to before. Jake's grip on the wheel tightened. His breath came faster. This isn't possible. He hit the gas, heart hammering as he sped past. A minute later, the car's temperature dropped suddenly, his breath fogging in the air. Then, a whisper. Soft, almost gentle. "Why didn't you stop?" Jake's body seized. The voice had come from the back seat. His heart slammed against his ribs. He didn't dare look in the mirror, but he could feel her. Cold air wrapped around him like fingers, suffocating. Wrong. "Take me home," she whispered. Jake yanked the wheel. The car swerved violently, tires screeching as he barely regained control. His pulse pounded in his ears, but when he dared to glance back, the back seat was empty. His breath came in ragged gasps. His hands were shaking. Just keep driving. But the road stretched endlessly, like it had no end. The darkness outside the car windows felt thicker, like something living. His headlights seemed weaker, swallowed by the night. Then, from the corner of his eye, a movement. Jake's stomach twisted as he realized. The woman was running alongside the car. Her dark dress billowed unnaturally, her feet barely touching the ground. She turned her head toward him, and for the first time, he saw her face. Her eyes were gone, just hollow, gaping sockets staring into him. Jake screamed, slamming his foot on the gas. The engine roared, the car shooting forward, but the woman kept pace. Faster, closer. Her mouth twisted into a grotesque grin, revealing jagged teeth too sharp, too long. Then, she lunged at the car. The windshield shattered. Glass exploded, the impact throwing Jake back as the car spun out of control. He fought the wheel, but it was useless. The car flipped. The world turned upside down, metal screeching, his body slamming into the seatbelt as the car rolled. And then, silence. A ringing in his ears. Darkness. Jake groaned, pain radiating through his body as he forced his eyes open. The car was upside down, smoke curling from the hood. His head throbbed, blood trickling down his forehead, and then footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming closer. Jake's breath hitched. His body screamed at him to move, but he was trapped, pinned by the weight of the wreckage. The footsteps stopped just outside the shattered windshield. And then a face appeared. Her face. Up close, her skin was ashen, cracked like old porcelain. Her hollow eye sockets bled, black and thick, dripping onto the broken glass. She grinned. "Take me home." Jake's scream never left his throat. When he woke, it was daylight. The car was still wrecked, smoke rising from the twisted metal. His body ached, his vision swimming. And yet, he was alone. No sign of her. No footprints. Only silence. With shaking hands, he pulled himself from the wreckage. In the distance, a gas station stood at the side of the road. Jake staggered toward it, his body weak, his mind reeling. The old man behind the counter looked up as Jake stumbled inside, his eyes dark with something unreadable. "She got in, didn't she?" the old man murmured. Jake froze. His breath came in short, panicked bursts. "Who?" the old man sighed, shaking his head. "You're not the first," he said quietly. Jake's blood ran cold. The man nodded toward the road. "She waits there, for drivers like you." Jake's stomach twisted. The old man's voice lowered. "If you ever see her again, don't stop. Don't look. Don't let her in." Jake swallowed hard. His reflection in the gas station window looked pale, shaken. Then he noticed something in his back pocket, a small, tattered note. With trembling hands, he pulled it out, unfolding the crumpled paper. Scrawled in smeared black ink were 3 words, "See you soon." Jake's breath hitched. And when he turned back toward the road, she was there, waiting, smiling.
Story number 6.
The road stretched endlessly through the dense fog, swallowing the beams of Nick's headlights before they could fully illuminate the path ahead. The night was eerily silent, save for the steady hum of his car's engine and the occasional chirp of unseen insects. Nick was exhausted. He had been driving for nearly 10 hours, his destination still another 100 miles away. His fingers ached from gripping the wheel, and his eyes burned from staring at the endless gray haze. He just needed to get through the back roads, a shortcut, he had told himself. The GPS had rerouted him to avoid a major accident on the interstate, but now, lost in the thickening mist, he wasn't sure if this was worth the detour. Then, out of the corner of his eye, a figure, standing at the edge of the road. Nick's breath hitched. A man, dressed in dark, ragged clothes, motionless by the tree line. His face was obscured by shadows, but Nick could feel him watching. His foot pressed harder on the gas. Just keep driving. But a mile later, another figure. This one closer to the road. Nick's stomach twisted into a knot. He glanced at his phone. No service. The fog thickened. The road seemed to narrow, as if pressing in around him. Then, his headlights flickered, the radio crackled with static, and suddenly, there was someone in the middle of the road. Nick's foot slammed the brake, tires screeching against the damp asphalt. The car skidded violently before coming to a shuddering stop, barely missing the figure standing just inches in front of his hood. Nick's pulse thundered in his ears. His headlights cast a pale glow over the figure. A woman. Dressed in a tattered white dress, her hair long and damp, hanging limply over her face. She didn't move. Nick's breath came in short gasps. Every instinct screamed at him to drive, to get out of here, but before he could react, the passenger door clicked. It unlocked by itself. Nick's stomach dropped. The door slowly creaked open. His fingers tightened around the wheel, but his body was frozen, his mind screaming for him to move. Then, she got in. Nick's breath hitched. He couldn't look. He couldn't bring himself to turn his head, but out of the corner of his eye, he could see her. Sitting perfectly still in the passenger seat, hands folded neatly in her lap. Her head tilted slightly toward him. The air inside the car grew frigid. His breath fogged in the air, then she whispered, "Drive." Nick's foot trembled against the gas pedal. The road stretched ahead into nothingness. The mist swallowed everything outside the glow of his dying headlights. But he obeyed. He drove. The woman didn't move, didn't speak, but he could feel her watching him. His fingers burned against the wheel, his pulse thundering in his ears. Minutes passed, maybe hours. The road was never ending. His phone was still dead, the gas gauge never moved, he was trapped. Then slowly she turned her head toward him. Nick's stomach twisted. He refused to look. Then, a whisper. "You've been here before." Nick's throat tightened. "What? You always come back." His fingers dug into the wheel. "I don't know what you're talking about." A long silence. Then, "Would you like to see?" Nick's body seized as the world shifted. The road disappeared. The car was no longer moving. He was somewhere else. A different road. A car. His car. But it was flipped over, crumpled metal wrapped around a tree. The windshield shattered, the glass glistening under the pale glow of a broken streetlight. And inside, a body. His body. Nick's breath caught in his throat. His own lifeless eyes stared back at him from the wreckage, blood staining his face. The night rushed back, reality slamming into him like a truck. He was back in his car. The woman still beside him, his hands trembled. "What was that?" She didn't answer. The fog outside thinned just enough for him to see something up ahead. A familiar gas station. A place he knew. A place he had been before. Nick's heart pounded. He pulled into the lot, his body still shaking. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows against the pavement. The woman in the passenger seat was gone. His hands gripped the wheel, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He stumbled out of the car, legs weak beneath him. An old man stood behind the counter inside, watching him through the glass. Nick staggered in, his voice hoarse. "What the hell is happening?" The man sighed. "You don't remember, do you?" Nick's stomach twisted. "Remember what?" The old man rubbed his tired eyes. "You never make it past this road." Nick's blood ran cold. The man's voice was quiet, careful. "You died here. A long time ago." Nick's breath hitched. His pulse thundered in his ears. The car wreck, the visions, the woman, the whispers. "No," Nick choked out. "No, that's not. She keeps bringing you back," the old man interrupted. "Every time you take this road, every time you try to leave, she finds you." Nick's hands shook. "This isn't real." he whispered. The old man's expression darkened. That's what you said last time. Nick's world tilted. His pulse slowed. Then a buzz from his pocket. His phone. One new message. With trembling fingers, he pulled it out. The screen glowed in the dim light. 3 words. See you soon. Nick's stomach dropped. And in the reflection of the gas station window, she was standing behind him, smiling.
Story number 7.
The storm raged against the night sky as Brian drove through the winding back roads of West Virginia. Sheets of rain pounded his windshield, his wipers barely keeping up. His GPS had lost signal hours ago, and the road signs were scarce. He should have been home by now. The gas station attendant had warned him not to take the old country roads this late, but Brian had ignored him. A shortcut. He just wanted to get home faster. But now, he wasn't so sure. The road seemed wrong. It twisted unnaturally, curving in ways that didn't make sense. The trees loomed taller, their branches reaching toward the car like skeletal fingers. Then through the rain, a figure, standing in the middle of the road. Brian's heart lurched. A man, tall and motionless, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. His clothes were soaked through, his hair plastered to his pale face. Brian barely had time to react. His hands jerked the wheel, tires screeching as the car veered off the road. The vehicle skidded, slamming into the muddy ditch with a violent jolt. For a long moment, everything was still. Brian's breath came in ragged gasps. The storm howled outside, rain hammering the roof. He forced himself to look up. The road was empty. The man was gone. Brian swallowed hard, his hands shaking. His headlights flickered, the beams cutting weakly through the storm. Then, a whisper. Soft. Inside the car. You shouldn't be here. Brian's blood ran cold. His breath hitched, his fingers tightening around the wheel. The air shifted, suddenly thick with the scent of damp earth and something rotting. Slowly, his gaze drifted toward the passenger seat. A man sat there, the same man from the road. His head lolled to the side, neck at an impossible angle, his unblinking eyes locked onto Brian. His lips curled into a too-wide grin, revealing jagged, rotting teeth. Brian's scream got stuck in his throat. His body froze, unable to move. The man's voice came again, layered and wrong. You never listen. Brian lunged for the door handle, his fingers fumbling desperately, but the door wouldn't budge. The man in the passenger seat leaned closer. His breath was cold against Brian's ear. You shouldn't have taken this road. Then, the car shifted. The weight of something heavy pressed against the roof. The metal groaned under the strain. Something was crawling on top of the car. Brian's pulse thundered. His breath came in sharp, shallow gasps. Slowly, he tilted his head upward. The rain streaked across the windshield, distorting his view. But through the blurred glass, he saw it. A hand. Pale, clawed fingers pressed against the glass, dragging slow, deliberate scratches across the surface. Then another hand. Then a face. A grotesque, grinning face with hollow, black eyes peered down at him from above. Brian's body seized. The pressure on the car increased. The roof began to cave inward, metal screeching as something massive pressed down. Then, a deafening bang. The windshield shattered. Brian didn't think. He threw himself against the door, the handle finally giving way. He stumbled into the mud, rain soaking through his clothes. His car groaned, the weight of the unseen creature crushing it further. Brian didn't dare look back. He ran, through the rain, through the dark. His feet slipped in the mud, branches slashed at his arms, but he didn't stop. Then, a light, flickering in the distance. A gas station. Brian's chest heaved as he sprinted toward it, his body screaming in protest. The neon sign buzzed weakly as he stumbled inside, collapsing against the counter. An old man stood behind it, his face impassive. You took the old road, didn't you? The man asked. And Brian's breath hitched, his entire body shook. The old man sighed, shaking his head. You never listen, he murmured. Brian's stomach twisted, his pulse pounded in his ears. What was that thing? The old man didn't answer. Instead, he slid something across the counter. A photograph. Brian's hands trembled as he picked it up. His blood turned to ice. The photo was of a wrecked car. His car, wrapped around a tree. And inside, a body. His body. Brian's breath caught in his throat. No, he whispered. That's not. You died on that road, the old man said quietly. Brian's vision swam. The world tilted. No, he was alive. He had just... Then, from the corner of his eye, a reflection in the gas station window. The same grinning man, standing right behind him.
Story number 8.
The road stretched out like a ribbon of darkness beneath Jacob's tires. The only light came from his high beams, cutting through the suffocating night. The trees on either side of the road loomed tall, their twisted branches clawing at the sky. He had been driving for hours. The GPS had stopped working miles ago, leaving him alone in the endless expanse of backroads. His phone had no signal. Every turn he took felt wrong, as if the road was shifting under him. And then a shape appeared in the distance. Jacob's breath hitched. A woman stood at the edge of the road. She was facing away from him, her long, dark hair hanging limply down her back. She wore a white dress, tattered and stained with something dark. Jacob's hands tightened around the wheel. He slowed down, unsure of what to do. She didn't move. Did she need help? His foot hovered over the brake, but a chill ran through his spine. Something about her felt wrong. Then she turned her head. Jacob's stomach twisted into a knot. Her face was pale and gaunt, her hollow eyes black as the night around her. Her mouth stretched into a wide, unnatural grin. Jacob's pulse thundered. The woman lifted her arm and pointed directly at him. Jacob slammed his foot on the gas. The car lurched forward, tires skidding against the damp pavement. His breath came in short, panicked bursts as he sped past her. But something moved in the back seat. Jacob's hands trembled. A soft whisper filled the car. "You should have stopped." His heart seized. She was inside. Jacob's hands jerked the wheel, the car swerving violently. His breath caught in his throat as he fought for control. Then a cold hand gripped his shoulder. Jacob screamed. The car veered off the road. The world spun, glass shattered, metal twisted. Darkness. Jacob woke with a sharp pain in his ribs. His car was upside down, smoke curling from the engine. The windshield was shattered, and rain dripped through the broken windows. For a moment, he just breathed, his mind struggling to process what had happened. Then, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming closer. Jacob's chest tightened. He turned his head. She was there, crawling toward him. Her limbs moved in jerky, unnatural motions, her body twisted in ways that weren't human. Her hollow eyes locked onto his, and she whispered, "You can't leave." Jacob's breath hitched. His body screamed for him to move, but he was trapped. The woman's mouth stretched wider, revealing rows of jagged, rotting teeth. She lunged. Jacob blacked out. When he woke, the car was gone. The road was empty. His clothes were dry. His body had no wounds. Had it all been a nightmare? Jacob's pulse slowed. He turned in a daze, trying to make sense of it all. And then he saw it. A signpost by the side of the road. Rusted and worn, nearly unreadable, it read, "Jacob Dawson died here, 1996. His blood ran cold." Jacob took a step back. No, this wasn't real. This couldn't be real. Then a whisper, soft, close. "See you soon." Jacob turned, and she was smiley-eyed.